So, as I mentioned today, I do think that location matters when it comes to the cloud. There's the sense that somehow it's at the cloud, it's anywhere. But in fact, there are some real opportunities from a Canadian perspective when we start thinking about cloud. We sense some competitive advantages. I can think of a couple to start with. One is a regulatory advantage. And so if we see that the individuals are concerned with privacy security related issues, it appears based on the studies that CA's done that that's the same is true for the executive levels and the IT side. Also, privacy really rising to the fore as a core concern. Canada's got regulations in place that are seen by many as world-class, certainly meet international standards, and provide a layer of privacy protection and a certain amount of assurance that you don't necessarily get in all jurisdictions. And if you're ensuring that the data stays within the jurisdiction and is subject to those regulations and can be enforced effectively, to me that provides a pretty nice advantage in terms of providing, yes, a level of assurance, a comfort level when it comes both to individuals who might know that the data is going out to the cloud, as well as organizations that want to make use of those kinds of services. So I think there's a big opportunity there. I think there's, interestingly enough, and this is, I take no credit for the idea, it's Bill St. Arnaud, who's one of the leading thinkers in this area, who talks a lot about green IT and sort of the link between environmental concerns and IT, and notes that we've got an advantage here by virtue of our location as well, where when you think about the costs of running cloud systems, essentially the costs on the server side, there's an equipment cost and there's an energy cost, and we all know that it's the energy costs that have become a critical part of the equation. You see when people decide where they're going to set up their server farms and infrastructure, energy costs become a critical component as part of that equation. Well, keeping the servers cool is where so much of those energy dollars come from, and having cold weather, quite frankly, in the north represents a real opportunity where both it's easier to keep it cool and the heat that's generated can be repurposed for other uses. And so suddenly you've got some real opportunities from a cloud perspective, where you can, from an environmental perspective, say we're more energy efficient, we're better on the environmental side, we've got the networks that run from the north down throughout North America, and so from a speed perspective, people aren't going to notice any sort of difference. It's going to be solid in that respect. And there are some advantages that we have that some other jurisdictions don't necessarily have. I mean, in some ways that's a good news, bad news situation, it seems to me. So C-29 involves reforms to our existing privacy legislation. The good news is it includes new mandatory security breach disclosure requirements. And I think that's a necessary component in building confidence, so that individuals whose security has been breached will know that breach has occurred. And I think that's a pretty important part of providing a comfort level with knowing that your data's somewhere else, but at least if something happens to it, there's a requirement to let you know. You can essentially mitigate against the potential damages that could arise. So in that sense, I think there's some real value. There are some concerns, though. There's concerns both that security breach requirements don't come with any sort of penalties. And so, organizations that might look at whether or not they're actually going to follow through and disclose may, as part of that analysis, say, well, what's the penalty if we don't? And right now, there aren't any financial penalties for not doing so. I think we need to amend the bill to ensure that happens. There are also other changes to the privacy legislation that I think are less pro-privacy, shall we say. And so one in particular involves a move towards mandating that organizations that disclose personal information under a mandate by law enforcement will be prohibited from disclosing the disclosure. It sounds, I think, to a lot of people a lot like USA Patriot Act style stuff. And I think that's worrisome. I think most Canadians have an expectation that as part of striking that privacy balance, you've got a right to know when your information's been disclosed. I think there's a role for both. It's certainly not something that government's going to do alone. I don't think anybody would have the expectation reasonably that you'd expect government to establish cloud services or server farms somewhere. So, and that's how we become a leader. But at the same time, there needs to be some leadership from government, and building that part of that piece of the equation, that piece of the puzzle, into the broader framework of what it means to have a digital economy strategy is where government can come into play. But it's also clear that the private sector is going to have to step up to the plate as well.